All right, this is a very special part of the evening. I now have the pleasure of introducing acclaimed author, husband, volunteer, advocate, and tonight's Bid for a Cure speaker. Let's hear it for Ray Poole.
The night I met Rebecca, she told me her cough wasn't contagious. I'm the one on the right. After that, she told me she had cystic fibrosis, and she asked me if I knew what that was. And I said I'd heard of it, which I probably had. I might have. I definitely heard the word fibrosis. Somehow she saw through my well-crafted facade and recognized I had no idea what that actually meant. So on one of our early dates, she gave me an 8-page medical journal article explaining the genetic mutation and the effects of the disease. As I read it, I tried to wrap my head around this 20-year-old with a 30-year life expectancy. At the time, I didn't even realize 30 years was for a baby born that year. She'd already outlived her life expectancy just by making it to college age. Slowly, I recognized the reality of living with the disease. I watched her handle so much more than our classmates. She was managing her prescriptions, insurance, controlling her diabetes, and I even had to perform manual PT on her. Like, I was starting to really understand what was involved there, but she was such a force, and she was so impressive. But I didn't really learn the challenge of CF until she was on her first clinical. She was down in Virginia, and she was working at her clinical full-time, working part-time to earn money, and her insurance had given her some generic enzymes that didn't really do the job at the time. And she was not able to gain weight, she was losing weight, and she ended up in the hospital with pneumonia. I remember I drove down from Connecticut, showed up at the hospital, and I couldn't believe how extremely thin her arm was reaching up to talk to the nurse. She was thin to begin with, but this was shocking to me, and it was an eye-opener. As the years went on, we got engaged, then married. According to our schedule, I missed the target proposal date, and not many people know, but the actual wedding was later than it was supposed to be because I missed that date, and ultimately she only had a year to perform the planning for that wedding. But despite the insufficient time that I had left her, she somehow managed to plan it, and we somehow managed to get married, which was amazing. The years that followed, though, brought this reliable decline in her health. She started with these routine tune-ups where she would go in the hospital for 2 weeks, and she would come out healthier, and it was about once a year. Then that increased to twice a year. Then she ended up on oxygen, and that was just when she slept and when she exercised. But by the end of 2014, she was on oxygen 24 hours a day, and she was going in for her 6th tune-up that year in December. And we were seeing less and less improvement after each one. It was New Year's Eve when she went into respiratory failure. She was placed on a ventilator in a chemically induced coma, and it just happened so quickly. As you see, 9 days from the photo on the left to the photo on the right. We had this wild New Year's Eve celebration planned. I was gonna bring in a laptop, and we were gonna watch a movie, and we were even thinking about watching 2 movies if we had enough time, but we didn't know. But by the time I got into the hospital that morning, she was in ICU on BiPAP, struggling to breathe. And when the doctor said the word intubate, it was the first time I'd seen Rebecca scared about her condition. She knew better than I did what being on a ventilator really meant. And if you saw that picture, she had this double thumbs up in the photo on the right. And that was when she signaled to me to take a picture. I took a picture, and then she gave me this thumbs up. And it was the last real communication we had had until February of that year. After 3 weeks in a coma, they told me that she was surprised that she'd survived this long. They also told me her lungs weren't likely to survive on a ventilator and that she wouldn't qualify for a transplant, that she was too sick. At that point, I was hoping they could wake her up and we could just have one more conversation. I just wanted a little more time. At that point, we weren't even hopeful that she could get that transplant. We were hopeful, but it wasn't likely. And every day was just a roller coaster. After 6 weeks, she started to stabilize. And she was stable enough where they could drop the sedation and potentially move her out of the ICU. Still on the ventilator, still without that prognosis changing. But it was hope. I'd hoped for just that one more conversation. They made it clear that she was likely going to move back to the ICU, never make it out of that hospital. In February, Rebecca woke from the coma. Our conversation wasn't as I had imagined it because she was still on the ventilator, so she couldn't actually speak. I had to figure out how to read her lips. Severe muscle atrophy and weeks of immobility left her unable to lift her hand more than a few inches off the bed. She couldn't even scratch her own cheek. If she was ever going to get a transplant or even just survive a little bit longer, she needed to be stronger. We worked towel squeezes and apple presses and any kind of movement that we could. When we went for a walk, it wasn't just exercise, it was a way to prove to potential transplant hospitals that she was strong enough. We documented every walk, how far she went. We went out with a full crew. We had a respiratory therapist managing the ventilator, a physical therapist spotting her. I was behind with a wheelchair in case she needed brakes. And it was hard work to try to build that strength up. And we worked for months, bouncing back and forth between the long-term acute care and the ICU. And after applying to 6 transplant hospitals, we heard back from one after the next. No. 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 First 5 hospitals wouldn't even evaluate her, some of which had cared for her. Our very last hope was the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And when they said they would, we were thrilled. It was a definite maybe. We took a medical flight there, and that was our only hope. This one transplant hospital, that they would evaluate her and say yes, they'd list her. The tests in Pittsburgh were going well, and we were hopeful that she'd be listed, and it was almost a half a year by this point of walking on eggshells daily, relying on technology to keep her alive. Unfortunately, after about 2 weeks there, she crashed. Her blood pressure dropped to 57/30, and her oxygen saturation dropped to 29%. She almost died and was saved by something called ECMO, which is a machine that mechanically adds oxygen to the blood and removes carbon dioxide, because a ventilator isn't enough to make that happen. They told us that she maybe had 2 weeks when she got on this machine. And at that point, she wasn't even listed. In the other photo that you saw on the right, that was Rebecca's 38th birthday. She spent that in the hospital, unable to move because she was on ECMO, hoping desperately for a transplant. And again, knowing that 2 weeks, all we wanted was just a little more time. Then on June 28th, 2015, Rebecca received a double lung transplant that saved her life. It was almost unbelievable when they told us the lungs were good and they started prepping her for surgery. We felt like we had our miracle. I could barely believe it when I got a call in a waiting room that it was done and successful. And as you could see on a picture from the right, she could barely believe it when she saw her old lungs. That's a photo of her looking at her old lungs while breathing with her new lungs. It's been a challenging 10 years since then. She's had stomach surgeries and infections. She's had a kidney transplant last year. She continues to push forward, and she's stronger now than ever, but we're well aware that there's work still needed. We continue to volunteer, fundraise, and speak because we recognize that any amount of progress that the CF Foundation has made has helped Rebecca. It's given her a little more time, and a little more time. and that's added up to a lot more time. But after that experience, I want to do everything in my power to prevent other families from having to go through what we went through. No mother should have to look at their son in that way. No child should see their parents suffering like that. And no husband should have to see his wife like that. We're here to write a better story for people with CF. We're here to fund more science, find more therapies, and ultimately develop a cure so that we could be done with this disease. Whatever brought you here, whether it was a loved one, a friend, or simply the intent to do good, we're here to cure CF, and I'm thankful to each and every one of you for showing up and supporting this great cause. Tonight, let's take a big step forward toward ending CF. Let's change the meaning of those two letters, CF, to cured forever. Thank you.